Racist cop sentenced to life in prison for pointing gun at military general during funeral. The crisp, cold air of Arlington National Cemetery hung heavy with sorrow, the overcast sky mirroring the grief of those gathered. Rows of uniformed soldiers stood at solemn attention, their medals gleaming dimly under the gray light, their expressions grim. A folded American flag was clenched in the hands of a weeping widow, her fingers trembling as she clutched onto the last physical remnant of the man she had lost. Standing at the front, dressed in a pristine uniform, was General Nathaniel Carter, one of the highest-ranking officers in the United States Army. His posture was rigid, his face unreadable behind dark aviators, his deep brown skin contrasting against the immaculate white of his gloves. He had seen battle, commanded thousands, and witnessed the loss of soldiers under his leadership. But today was personal. The man being buried, Major Thomas Reynolds, had been more than a soldier. He had been a brother in arms, a friend, a man Nathaniel had mentored from the time he was a fresh recruit to the moment he became a decorated officer. And now he was gone, taken by an IED in the heart of a foreign desert. The ceremony was nearly over. A 21-gun salute had echoed through the hills, the last note of the bugle had faded into the wind, and all that remained was the final farewell. Nathaniel inhaled sharply, steadying himself as he prepared to step forward and pay his respects. And then it happened. A sharp, commanding voice sliced through the quiet. "Get down. Hands where I can see them." A murmur of shock rippled through the crowd as heads whipped toward the source of the commotion. Two uniformed police officers stood at the edge of the funeral gathering, their guns trained on General Nathaniel. The younger officer, a fresh-faced recruit with nervous fingers twitching over his holster, looked uncertain. The older one, Sergeant Mike Dawson, was a burly, middle-aged white man with a hardened scowl twisting his face. Nathaniel didn't move. The mourners gasped. Soldiers exchanged stunned glances, some instinctively reaching for their holsters before realizing they were unarmed for the funeral. The widow of Major Reynolds let out a horrified sob. Nathaniel's voice was calm, measured, the voice of a man who had commanded troops under enemy fire. "What do you think you're doing?" he asked, his baritone as sharp as steel. Dawson took a step closer, his finger dangerously close to the trigger. "I said, hands up, now." The tension was suffocating. No one moved. The only sound was the wind rustling through the trees and the distant echo of boots shifting uneasily on the wet grass. Nathaniel Carter, a four-star general, combat veteran and war hero, stood unmoving. His expression didn't change. He had been in situations far more dangerous than this, but the sheer disrespect burning in Dawson's gaze was something else. "You're making a mistake," Nathaniel said simply, his voice unshaken. Dawson's lip curled, his grip on the gun tightening. "Oh yeah, and what mistake is that?" Nathaniel tilted his head, his voice quiet, almost dangerous, the kind that ends careers. But Dawson didn't listen. The racist officer had no idea who he was dealing with, and he was about to learn the hard way. Gasps rippled through the mourners. The honor guard, composed of high-ranking officers and decorated soldiers, exchanged bewildered glances, their hands clenching at their sides. This wasn't some random civilian Dawson was targeting. This was General Nathaniel Carter, one of the most respected military leaders in the country. And yet, the officer's gun remained fixed on him, as if he were nothing more than a criminal. A slow, heavy silence fell over the cemetery, interrupted only by the rustling of leaves and the distant roll of thunder. Nathaniel still hadn't moved. His chest rose and fell steadily, his broad shoulders squared as he stared down Sergeant Dawson, who was growing red in the face. I said, "Hands up." Dawson barked again, his voice rising, filled with something deeper than authority. It was arrogance. It was bias. It was the belief that he had the power to do whatever he wanted, even if it meant holding a highly decorated black military general at gunpoint at a funeral. The younger officer next to him, Officer Chris Miller, hesitated, shifting uneasily. His hands twitched near his holster, but he wasn't as quick to raise his weapon. "Sergeant, I don't think," Miller stammered, his nervous blue eyes darting between Dawson and the crowd of horrified soldiers. But Dawson didn't hear him. He was fixated, obsessed with the idea that Nathaniel Carter was a threat. Nathaniel exhaled slowly. He had been through 3 wars, countless missions, assassination attempts, bombings, and firefights in the most hostile terrains on Earth. Yet here he was, back on American soil, at the burial of a fallen soldier, being treated like an enemy. Not because he had done anything wrong, but because of the color of his skin. The other officers and soldiers present weren't just witnesses. They were stunned spectators to what should have been impossible. They had all served under Nathaniel, had heard his speeches, had followed his commands. Some of them owed their lives to his leadership. Yet none of that seemed to matter to Dawson. Nathaniel's voice, dangerously calm, finally spoke. "I'll give you one more chance," he said, his tone so calm it felt like a threat. "Lower your weapon." Dawson scoffed. "That's not how this works. I give the orders here." Nathaniel's lips barely moved. "No, Sergeant, you don't." The weight in those words sent a ripple of unease through everyone standing nearby. Even Officer Miller was visibly sweating now. He turned to Dawson, his voice urgent. "Sergeant, sir, I really think we should—" "Shut up, Miller," Dawson snapped, his finger twitching on the trigger. The soldiers nearby stiffened, muscles tensing. It wouldn't take much, one wrong move, one panicked breath, one twitch of Dawson's finger, and an innocent man would be shot. Nathaniel, however, remained still, his battle-hardened expression unreadable. Then finally he spoke again. "What exactly do you think I did?" The question hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Dawson sneered, his jaw tightening. "I don't take orders from people like you. This is a military funeral. You're not supposed to be here." The words dripped with unspoken accusations. Nathaniel blinked once. "People like me?" Dawson didn't back down. He squared his shoulders, still pointing his gun at Nathaniel's chest. "You don't belong here. You were acting suspicious, standing too close to the casket, whispering something." Nathaniel almost laughed. He had spoken a prayer before stepping forward. A prayer. And Dawson, seeing a black man standing at the front of a funeral, had immediately assumed something sinister. The other officers were horrified. Dawson, however, wasn't finished. "Now, I won't say it again. Get on the ground." That was it. That was the breaking point. Nathaniel's gaze, sharp as a blade, swept over the scene. He didn't move, but suddenly it felt like he was the one in control. His next words changed everything. "Sergeant Dawson," he said, his voice a quiet command, "do you know who you just drew your weapon on?" Dawson scoffed. "Doesn't matter. The law is the law." A slow, dangerous smirk spread across Nathaniel's face. "Wrong answer." And with that, the funeral standoff exploded into something Dawson never saw coming. For the first time since drawing his weapon, Sergeant Dawson hesitated. The arrogance in his face wavered. Just a flicker, but it was there. Something in General Nathaniel Carter's tone, in the way he stood unshaken in the face of a loaded gun, made Dawson falter. And then the whispers started. The soldiers, the officers, the mourners, everyone at the funeral had begun murmuring amongst themselves. "You don't know who that is?" a stunned young lieutenant muttered under his breath. "He's an idiot if he doesn't," another officer whispered back. Officer Miller, still standing beside Dawson, looked like he wanted to crawl into the nearest grave. His face had gone pale, his jaw clenched so tight it looked painful. He glanced at the soldiers standing behind Nathaniel. Men and women in full uniform, their ribbons and ranks making it clear that these weren't just any soldiers. These were some of the most decorated, respected individuals in the military. And they were all staring at Dawson with a mix of disbelief and fury. Dawson's finger, still hovering over the trigger, began to tremble. The weight of the situation was crashing down on him. He had drawn his weapon on a 4-star general, a man who had dedicated his life to serving his country, a man who had earned the respect of every soldier present. And now, he was about to learn the consequences of his actions. General Nathaniel took a single step forward, his presence commanding the space. "Sergeant Dawson," he said, his voice low but carrying the weight of authority, "you have exactly 5 seconds to lower your weapon and stand down. If you don't, I promise you this will not end well for you." The silence that followed was deafening. Dawson's face flushed red, then pale, as the reality of his mistake sank in. Slowly, reluctantly, he lowered his gun, his hands shaking. Officer Miller immediately stepped forward, taking the weapon from him, his own expression a mix of relief and embarrassment. Nathaniel didn't say another word. He simply turned back to the casket, his head bowed in respect for the fallen soldier he had come to honor. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the general paid his final respects, his dignity unshaken, his authority unquestioned. As the ceremony concluded and the mourners began to disperse, Sergeant Dawson was escorted away by his superiors, his career hanging by a thread. General Nathaniel Carter, however, walked away with his head held high, a living testament to the strength, resilience, and unyielding integrity of a true leader. Harper kept struggling, his voice rising in desperation. "This is insane. I was doing my job." A scoff came from behind him. It was Colonel Davis. She folded her arms, her expression one of pure icy disgust. "Your job?" she echoed, her voice sharp as a blade. "Your job is to uphold the law, not abuse it." Harper whipped his head toward her, his eyes darting between all the officers present. His voice grew desperate, cracking under the weight of his own panic. "This is a mistake. I didn't know who he was. That's not my fault." And there it was, the final desperate attempt to escape accountability. Not an apology, not an admission of guilt, but a feeble excuse that only dug his grave deeper. Colonel Davis stepped closer, her boots crunching against the damp earth. Her voice was low, but it carried the weight of a thunderclap. "Ignorance is no excuse, Sergeant. You pointed a weapon at a 4-star general. At a funeral. You don't get to play the victim here." Harper's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. He turned to Carter, his eyes pleading, but the general's expression was unreadable. Carter stood tall, his posture immaculate, his gaze steady. He didn't need to say a word. His silence spoke volumes. The 2 MPs tightened their grip on Harper's arms, their movements precise and unyielding. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with a buzz cut, leaned in close. "Sergeant Douglas Harper, you are hereby relieved of your duties and will be held in custody pending a formal investigation. Do you understand?" Harper's breath hitched. "No, no, no, this can't be happening. You can't do this to me." But the MPs were already moving, dragging him toward a waiting Humvee parked at the edge of the cemetery. Harper's legs buckled, but they held him upright, their grip unrelenting. The crowd of soldiers, officers, and mourners parted like the Red Sea, their faces a mix of shock, anger, and grim satisfaction. As Harper was shoved into the back of the vehicle, his eyes locked onto Carter one last time. The general hadn't moved an inch. He stood like a statue, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression calm but unyielding. Harper's voice cracked as he shouted, "You think this makes you a hero? You think this makes you better than me?" Carter didn't respond. He didn't need to. The Humvee's doors slammed shut and the engine roared to life. Harper's muffled protests could still be heard as the vehicle sped away, leaving a cloud of dust in its wake. The silence that followed was deafening. The wind rustled through the trees, and the faint sound of a distant bugle playing. Taps echoed across the cemetery. Colonel Davis turned to Carter, her expression softening just slightly. "General, are you all right?" Carter nodded, his gaze still fixed on the horizon where the Humvee had disappeared. "I'm fine, Colonel, but this isn't about me. This is about accountability. About making sure something like this never happens again." Davis nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. "It's a shame it had to come to this, but you handled it with the dignity it deserved." Carter finally turned to face her, his eyes weary but resolute. "Dignity doesn't fix systemic issues, Colonel. This isn't just about one man's mistake. It's about a culture that allows those mistakes to happen in the first place." The crowd began to disperse, the weight of the moment settling over them like a heavy blanket. The widow of the fallen soldier, still clutching the folded flag, approached Carter with tears in her eyes. "General," she said softly, "thank you for standing up for what's right, for not letting this disgrace overshadow my husband's memory." Carter's stern expression softened as he looked down at her. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice gentle but firm. "Your husband was a hero, and heroes deserve to be honored with respect and integrity. What happened here today, it won't define his legacy. I'll make sure of that." As the widow nodded and stepped away, Carter turned to Colonel Davis. "We have work to do. This incident will be investigated thoroughly, and when it's over, we'll make sure every soldier in this army understands the consequences of their actions." Davis nodded, her expression hardening once more. "Understood, General. I'll start the paperwork immediately." Carter took one last look around the cemetery, his eyes lingering on the rows of white headstones stretching into the distance. Each one represented a life lost in service to their country. Each one deserved respect. As he turned to leave, the sound of boots crunching against gravel followed him. The soldiers and officers fell into step behind him, their heads held high. The funeral was over, but the battle for justice had just begun. And somewhere in the back of a speeding Humvee, Sergeant Harper sat in silence, his hands cuffed, his career in ruins, and the weight of his actions finally sinking in. The road ahead was long, and for Harper it was paved with consequences. But for Carter it was a path toward change, a chance to ensure that no soldier, no matter their rank or race, would ever have to face what he had faced today. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the cemetery, General Nathaniel Carter walked away with his head held high, ready to lead the fight for a better tomorrow. Note an ounce of remorse just used. Carter's expression didn't change, But when he finally spoke his words shit like a hammer, you didn't need to know who I was. Harper's breath caught. Carter took a calm step forward, staring Harper down. You needed to recognize that I was a man standing at a funeral mourning a fallen soldier. That should have been enough, but it wasn't. Harper's lips parted, but nothing came out because there was nothing to say. And then the final blow. The second MP, who had been quietly receiving orders through his earpiece, turned toward Harper with an unreadable expression. Sergeant Harper, you're being placed under arrest. The word shit like a gunshot. Harper's entire body stiffened. His knees nearly buckled to rest. No, wait, I didn't. What charges? Colonel Davis asked, coolly, already knowing the answer. The MP's response was lethal, brandishing a weapon without just cause, threatening a superior officer, abuse of power, unlawful use of force. Harper's face collapsed in horror. There weren't petty charges, that was career-ending, and worse, that was prison time. His panic exploded. He lunged forward, but the MP yanked him back. Wait, you can't do this. You can't arrest me for a mistake. I didn't mean to. Carter tilted his head, his voice as sharp as a blade. Oh son, how it was a mistake. Funny, a moment ago you were convinced you were doing your job. Harper's face burned with shame, because Carter was right. The reality had finally hit him. This wasn't going away. He wasn't just losing his job, he was losing everything, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Harper's breathing had turned shallower, Radicum grasping at the last fraying threads of control. But there were no more lifelines. The two military police officers held him firm, their grip yielding. His cuffs clanked as she twisted his wrists, the stark contrast between his reality just minutes ago and now crushing him like an avalanche. This was at the end of everything. I thought that could get away with. Wait. Just listen, he stammered, his voice rising in desperation. He turned toward Colonel Davis first, then toward Officer Bradley, then finally his wild eyes landed on Carter. General, sir, please. Carter raised a single hand. Harper went silent. The sheer authority in that small movement shut him down faster than a. Carter stepped closer, his gaze still calm, unreadable. He was neither angry nor triumphant. He simply looked at Harper like he was studying a man who had dug his own grave and only just realized it. And when Carter spoke, his voice was cold, unforgiving. Now you want to talk? Hest. Harper's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Carter took another slow step forward. When you pointed your gun at me, you weren't listening to a word I said. You weren't interested in talking. You were only interested in control. Harper swallowed hard. He had no argument because it was true. Carter didn't need to yell, didn't need to threaten. His presence alone commanded the moment. You saw my face, you saw my skin, and thought that was all you needed to know. Carter continued, his voice even. I wasn't a grieving officer. I wasn't a veteran. I wasn't a fellow American. I was just another suspect in your eyes. Harper shuddered. Carter let the silence settle over the funeral like a heavy fog. Then he exhaled slowly and spoke. Again, you came here today thinking you had authority, that your gun, your badge, your uniform made you untouchable. He tilted his head. How's that working out for you now? Harper winced. His shoulders slight in him was dying, because Carter was right. He had thought himself untouchable, had built a life on his power, but now he was powerless. The MP tightened their grip on his arms. Harper flinched. The widow of Major William Daniels Assis Castris, the very man this funeral was for. Assis stood nearby here. He's still wet with tears, but now she wasn't just grieving, she was watching, and so was everyone else. They had seen it all, every second of Harper's fall, and there was no coming back from this. Carter exhaled softly, glancing at the officers around him. Take him away, he said simply. The MP nodded. Harper panicked. Wait, but it was too late. The MP hauled him back. His boots dragged the campground as they marched him toward the patrol car parked just outside the cemetery gates. And just like that, Sergeant Doug Harper, the man who had wielded his power like a weapon, who had drawn his gun without hesitation, was now one being removed in cuffs. Justice was unfolding before everyone's eyes, and Harper had finally run out of places to hide. Harper dug his heels into the ground, but it was useless. The military police marched him forward, unwavering, their grip like steel. Every step toward the waiting patrol car was a nail in the coffin of his career. "You can't do this," Harper shouted, his voice cracking. "This isn't how it's supposed to go." But noon list. And Ed, not Carter, not Colonel Davis, not Officer Bradley, not the dozens of soldiers and officers standing in solemn silence watching his disgrace unfold, meant nothing now. Because he had already shown them who he truly was. The ceremony had been disrupted, the funeral desecrated, and the worst part, Harper hadn't even paused before pulling his weapon. He had done it so easily, and now the weight of that choice was finally pressing down on him. The MP hauled him toward the squad car. He twisted in their grips, urging for someone anyone who might give him a shred of support. His eyes locked onto Officer Bradley. The young cop was still standing near Carter, frozen, his hands clenched at his sides. Harper desperately latched onto him. "Bradley says something. You saw what happened. I didn't mean anything." Bradley's jaw tensed. He finally looked up, meeting Harper's eyes, and what Harper saw there made his stomach drop. There was no loyalty, no hesitation, only disgust. "Is everything?" Sergeant Bradley said quietly, and so'd everyone else. Harper's breath hitched, because that was it. At was the moment the knew he had burned every bridge, destroyed any chance at explaining his way out of this. He hadn't this to himself, and now he was completely alone. The MP finally shoved him into the back of the patrol cart. The doors slammed shut. Harper's face was ashen. He looked through the window, but noon was looking back at him. He had been erased. The car's engine rumbled to life. The MP got into the front seat, and without another word the patrol car pulled away from the cemetery, and just like that he was gone. For a long moment noon moved. The tension in the air was still, thick, the shock of what had just happened settling into the bones of everyone present. Then slowly Carter exhaled. He turned back to the casket of Major William Daniels. The folded flag still clutched in the widow's TRLing hands was streaked with her silent tears, and just like that everything that mattered came back into focus. Carter adjusted his uniform, then in one smooth motion, he knelt with quiet reverence. He reached out and pressed his palm gently over the casket, whispering something only the fallen soldier could hear. The ceremony had been tainted by racism, cruelty, by the abuse of power. But Carter would not allow that to be the final memory of this day. He closed his eyes, offering one last silent moment of respect, and then rose once more. "Resume the honor," she ordered. The honor guards snapped to attention. The bugler stepped forward, lifting his instrument, and with that the funeral continued. Because no matter what had just happened, the fallen deserved their final salute. The first note of taps rang through the cemetery, summer and slow, carrying through the cool air like a final goodbye. General Nathaniel Carter stood tall once more, his hands clasped behind his back. His gaze remained on the casket, his mind focused solely on the man they were here to honor. Sergeant Harper had tried to strip this moment of dignity, had tried to reduce a decorated general to a suspect, but Carter had refused to let him win. The real victory wasn't in Harper's fall, it was in this moment, a soldier being honored with the dignity he deserved somewhere beyond the cemetery gates. Sergeant Doug Harper sat in the back of a patrol car, his world crumbling around him. The weight of the handcuffs around his wrists wasn't just physical, it was the weight of his own decisions, of the life he had just destroyed. His mind raced. Would he be dishonorably discharged, imprisoned, sued, stripped of his badge, his pension, his reputation? The uncertainty made his chest tighten with panic, but one thing was clear: he was never going to wear that uniform. Back at the cemetery, the final note of taps faded into silence. The folded flag, now handed over to the widow, rested in her lap like a sacred artifact. Their fingers traced its edges, still fresh, but their expression no longer one of devastation. It was one of pride. Carter watched her for a moment before turning to leave. A shaded Colonel Davis fell into step beside him. "That was a disgrace," she muttered under her breath, glancing toward the gates, where Harper had been taken away. Carter nodded. "Yes, it was." She frowned. "What happens now?" Carter exhaled. What, opposed to his gaze, stayed. Forward unshaken, unmoved, the system will handle Harper his career, so he'll face the same justice he's denied to others. Davis scoffed, too little too late. Carter finally stopped walking and turned to face her. Maybe, but that's not my concern anymore. Davis blinked, taken aback. It's not. Carter's gazes wept over the rows of headstones. It's the thousands of lives given in service to a country that still, after all these years, had moments like today. No, he said, my concern is making sure people like him don't ruin what men like Daniels fought for. Davis let out a slow breath. Odding in with that, Carter walked away, leaving the weight of today behind him, because while Harper had fallen, their battle wasn't with him, it was with the next Harper, the next abuse of power. And Carter wasn't done fighting, not by a long shot. 3 days later, the news broke. Sergeant Harper has officially been relieved of duty and dishonorably discharged from the force. Following an internal investigation, he faces multiple charges, including unlawful use of force and abuse of power. If convicted, he could face a significant prison time. Carter watched the Wes' insolence before clicking off the TV. He had seen enough. Harper's fate no longer mattered, because justice had already been served, and Carter, he had more work to do.